My guest this morning here on Jersey Magazine is a New York Times best-selling author, Adam Makos. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning to you, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Your book, A Higher Call, has been out since 2012, and it tells an amazing story of an American B-17 bomber crew and a German fighter pilot. Tell our listeners the background of that story, Adam.
It may be the most unusual story of World War II. It was December 20th, 1943, when Charlie Brown was a young American bomber pilot on his first mission over Germany. His name really was Charlie Brown. He was you might say maybe he was the inspiration for the Peanuts character, but he came along, long ago. So this is a real guy, real story. And Charlie, his aircraft was shot up that day over Germany. He was trying just to limp home to get his crew back. He had one man dead, several men wounded, and he only made one mistake that day. He flew over a German airfield. And on that airfield was a young German fighter pilot named Franz Stiegler. And Franz was rearming and refueling. He had just shot down one American bomber. And he saw this plane come over and he said, let's get the second. And he took off. Franz was a big ace by then. He had already shot down more than a dozen aircraft. And he chased this B-17 down. And that's when this incredible encounter happened that has never happened since. It had never happened before. It's kind of a one-of-a-kind in World War II history.
You know, you mentioned that he had shot down a previous plane, and later on in the book, after you tell the story of these two pilots interacting, he actually went back to try to find that B-17 to make sure those pilots were okay.
Now, that part of the story, Jim, is so I've heard it so many times from different bomber crews. They've said, the crazy thing is I bailed out over Germany, and who comes to save me but the Luftwaffe? A lot of times, because the battlefield was over Germany, these air bases were all over the place. And so anytime an American crew would be shot down, a lot of times it wasn't always German pilots. Sometimes it would be the sergeants, the mechanics, the guards at the base. They would rush to get these guys because they knew a lot of times these farmers would be incensed by the bombing of the cities. A lot of times displaced people from German cities were living in the countryside. And so first thing they do is they get their hands on an American. They're going to stab him with a pitchfork or hang him from a tree. And so the Luftwaffe understood, well, hey, we're all stuck doing the same terrible thing. We're all flying in the same skies. And they would a lot of times save these Americans. That's what Franz Stiegler had done that day. He went to check on the crew that he had shot down, the one before he encountered Charlie. But what he did in the air was a crazy thing, where he came up on this bomber and should we tell people?
Sure, absolutely. It's an amazing story.
He did something that had never happened before or since. He saw this plane hanging by a thread. Literally, the nose was blown off of it. One of the elevators, the smaller tail on the back, was shot off. The rudder was almost hanging by a thread. It had one engine out, another engine smoking. Every inch of this plane had been riddled with bullets from earlier dogfights. And Franz had his finger on the trigger and he looked at this plane. He said, if I shoot this down, it would be no different than shooting a man in a parachute. And I won't be a soldier if I do that. I'll be a murderer. He took his finger off the trigger. Now, there was a deeper motivation for him when he grew up with his older brother, August, and the two of them loved to fly together. They flew gliders. They grew up in southern Bavaria. And his brother went off to war as a pilot, and he was killed during the Battle of Britain. And so Franz, who was drafted and became a flight instructor for the German Air Force, Franz went on this path of revenge. And he said, I'm going to get revenge against the men who killed my brother. Pretty human emotion. And that day in the sky, he flew up alongside this American B-17, and he looked over at this American crew, and their eyes met. He saw the wounded men in the back of the aircraft, and he saw the pilots struggling at the controls, and he felt like he was looking into the face of his own brother. Would he be his brother's killer? Would he walk down that path, or would he choose a different path?
We're bringing all of this up because, of course, Masters of the War has been on Apple Plus for a while now. Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, who have put this together. And I know you obviously did a ton of research on bomber crews and B-17s and what have you. How close do you think Hollywood has gotten it to what really happened in World War II with the 8th Air Force and bomber crews all over?
Jim, I think it's a pretty darn good representation. I mean, they have rumors where they spent $200 million on this. They've been working on it for a decade, but really, it's like a time capsule. That's the way I look at it. You're getting to see the recreation of a bomber base in England. They built three B-17s that are used for ground scenes and taxiing, and sometimes they hoisted them up on cranes. They literally rebuilt three of these aircraft. They can't fly, but they built them. You're going to get to see a POW camp. You get to see London. You're going to get to see officers clubs. You're getting to see the lives of these guys. And so it's a priceless show for that reason. And the aerial combat is pretty spot on. I think it's a little too frantic. It's a little too video gamey. Just the idea of the chaos. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. German fighter planes swooping in on a bomber formation. Franz Stiegler told me that there was no time that you went that you were not shaking in your boots when you had to go fly against B-17s. He said the first couple of times he came back with his pants wet. It was a head-on clash with these bombers. And when you combine the two speeds, it's happening at over 600 miles an hour, and it's going by in a blink. And yet there are these incredible moments where these two men across this frozen space, their eyes can meet and they realize, hey, we're all humans doing the same terrible thing.
Now, I know you've been inside a B-17 and actually, I believe, flown in one, as have I. My first impression, Adam, was the plane was a little bit smaller than what I expected. Of course, I had seen the movie and the TV show 12 O'Clock High, as well as some other movies about the B-17 bomber. And the other thought was, my God, this thing is so thin. There's no place to hide in this thing.
You're so right, Jim. It's and they flew with the windows open. So when you're going for your ride, as I did and you did, we're getting to we're running around the bomber, looking out the waist window, going up to the nose with the glass, and in the radio room, the wind is blowing in there. But you forget that there is less than a quarter of an inch of skin around that aircraft. It's literally a tin can flying in the air. And that's what makes it's so incredible and so tragic when you watch sometimes the old footage of these planes getting shot to pieces, because you realize that these bullets are going right through that plane from one end to the other. There's nowhere to hide up there. It was a scary, scary place to fly. And I feel like the TV series is showing people that. And it's showing me what Charlie Brown was talking about all those years ago when he told me his story.
I do have a slightly personal connection to the B-17. My dad's first cousin was a bombardier in a B-17. His crew was shot down over Belgium 6 days after the Normandy invasion. And he was captured by the Germans and taken to a prisoner of war camp. I believe he was in Stalag Luft 3. And if I'm not mistaken, and this is a bit of a spoiler, but anybody who's done a Google search for Buck Cleven knows that he did survive the war. If I'm not mistaken, they were in the same prison camp together. And some of the details that my dad's cousin wrote in a journal are just unbelievable. Some of the things that happened.
Wow. Well, then this story is incredibly personal for you. Um, I can't wait to see how they handle the POW camps going forward. But I know that a lot of this show is shocking to people. It's the idea of these are the conditions our guys were flying in. I think they're going to be shocked to find out that the POW camps, there was a level of humanity in them. Like I said, the Luftwaffe, a lot of times, they knew that the better they treated our guys, the better their guys would be treated. Because, we had a lot of their pilots in captivity in Alabama and Arizona, and the British had a lot of them up in Scotland. And so there was this humanity and there was this honor between warriors. And that's why Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler had this amazing ending to their story. So after Franz spared Charlie, saluted, and flew away, Charlie had to keep that story secret for most of his life. The Air Force at the time had told him, you're not to utter a word of what had happened, because we don't want the American public thinking there are good Germans. We still have a war to win. Franz couldn't tell what he did. He's not going to go back to his base and say, oh yeah, I spared that American bomber I took off to shoot down. He would have been a traitor, because American bombers at that time were flattening cities and even firebombing later in the war. So both men bottled this story up, and it only came full circle because Charlie Brown went to a bomb group reunion in the late 80s, and he told the story to his buddies. And they said, you owe it to yourself and to this German to find him. And it was the most mission impossible. I mean, I won't even spoil it, but they did become fishing buddies and they became best friends. And Charlie told me, Adam, I want you to go talk to Franz if you really want to get this story right. They found each other, but how he did it was incredible because think about it. All he knew was this German's face. They knew the place and the time, but 20,000 Luftwaffe pilots flew in World War II and only 2,000 survived.
That's an
And
incredible statistic.
and the same with the American Eighth Air Force. They lost 26,000 men, more than the Marine Corps. But in Franz's case, a Luftwaffe pilot, if you survived the war, if you were that lucky 2,000, you went home to a country that had been bombed to pieces and people blamed you for it. That was shocking to me when Franz told me I couldn't find a job in my hometown because instead of the Nazi party taking responsibility for dragging their nation into its destruction, they said the fighter pilots failed you. They failed to keep the bombs from falling. They are the villains, not Goring and Himmler and Goebbels and Hitler. It's those guys. And so the people began to turn against their own Air Force. And then after the war, if you were Franz Stiegler, you couldn't go to university. You couldn't resume any kind of white collar job. The best you could hope for would be bricklaying. Or I talked to a German fighter pilot. He said, I fixed sewing machines. That's what I did. One day they're in the cockpit, 20,000 feet, trying to stop the bombers from hitting their country. Next day they're fixing sewing machines.
In fact, early in the book, when you're talking about Stiegler's background, you mentioned him wearing his flight boots, and that was a dead giveaway that he had been a pilot while he's online trying to get a job at bricklaying. And the reaction that people gave him, it was amazing.
Yeah, they could have spit on him, and that was coming out of World War II. It wasn't that the SS was the villain. It wasn't the concentration camp guards. They chose to really villainize the guys who had fought the hardest for them, and in some cases who fought with pretty genuine intentions. You know, bombers are coming to blow up our country. We're going to go stop them. And so Franz had to leave his own country. He emigrated to Canada in the early 50s. And that's where I was able to find him. That's how Charlie Brown found him. And that's how we have this incredible story today.
You know, there's a scene, and you and I were talking about this before we came on the air this morning. There was a scene in episode 5 where a German fighter pulls up next to a B-17, and all of a sudden it's in slow motion. And the American and German pilots make eye contact with each other. And that's all I could think of was your book, A Higher Call, when I saw that scene.
It gave me a chill, Jim, and it also that reminds you of the humanity. It reminds you that guy in that other cockpit might be as scared as I am. And that's why this story of Franz and Charlie is so special. And not because I wrote it, it's because they lived it. It was real. And we get to follow all their battles leading to that moment where their eyes meet. And then we get to follow what Franz did after that. How do you go back and how do you fly till the end of the war? You have to get back in the cockpit. You have to fight your enemy now. And you know he's a human and you've spared him and you don't want to be there. It makes for a heck of a drama.
You also mentioned to me that you had approached, I don't know whether it was Spielberg or Hanks, I forget now, but you mentioned about, possibly making a movie about your book.
Yeah, back when this book came out, 2012, a producer had optioned it and he brought it to Steven Spielberg and the producer called me up. He said, well, I talked to Spielberg about your book. I said, okay. And I'm on pins and needles. He said he loves it. If he wasn't doing this Masters of the Air, he would be willing to take a look at it. And so I was a year too late. But you know what? Each story will come to light in its own time. And I think right now we're going to really start pushing this as a film because I think people are going to want more of this. And I think it's time to look at the other side and see that one man in a cockpit by himself facing the whole world against him. So I think A Higher Call is just coming into its own.
So many of us are either the children of World War II veterans or the grandchildren of World War II veterans. They are passing away at an extraordinary rate right now. And it's amazing that stories like yours in the book, A Higher Call, and what Spielberg and Hanks have done with Masters of the Air is helping to keep their stories alive. And I think that's so important. Adam, for WDHA and WMTR listeners who want to learn more about you and your books, where do they go?
Jim, the book is available everywhere. So A Higher Call, bookstores everywhere, of course, online. And I promise if they give this a try, they're going to be up for a few nights straight. This is one that you crack it open and you're sucked in. And again, it's not because I'm a great writer. It's because the story is one of the best.
Thank you so much for your time this morning here on Jersey Magazine. I appreciate it.
Hey, Jim, love talking to you. Let's do it again someday.